I've partially been recording this course using Blender 278, and I finished it with Blender 279. There is a little difference in the sculpt tools when using dynamic topology. Whenever I start something like this, I do prefer start from a base cube. I'm not a big fan of box modeling to get a base mesh, but if you prefer to do so, that's okay. It's not a problem. So what you will see me doing a lot is using the subdivision modifier to get a higher resolution whenever I start a new shape. So you can add this subdivision modifier going into the modifier and select subdivision, or you can press Ctrl 3, 4, 5, whatever, and it will set a subsoft modifier automatically with the level you've set by pressing the number. So then I just apply it, and I have a nice 3D sphere based on a cube topology. So now let's dive into sculpt mode. I will just show you few options that are very useful. So you have the symmetry here. This is the very first thing I want to show you. So whenever I press to sculpt, you see here it got symmetrized. But we can also use Y symmetry and Z symmetry, and all of them at on. So generally you will use the X symmetry lock, symmetry mirror, sorry. And then you have those locks here that allow you to sculpt only on one or two or all stuff. So here, if I try to sculpt pushing on the X, it doesn't work as it's locked. I'm not using this very often, but in some case this can be useful. Regarding the brush, we have all of them here. So please note that they are accessible by pressing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, etc. or by pressing Shift 1, Shift 2, Shift 3, Shift 4, etc. to get to the higher levels here. Some of them also have another shortcut. For example, the grab brush is G. So as when we move stuff in the 3D viewport here, the crease brush is Shift C, X for the draw brush, and P for the pinch brush. There are probably others, but generally you will go for G to get the grab brush and then press the number of your favorite brush here. Finally, there is the M for masking that will allow us to mask part of the mesh. So as you may know, we can choose add or subtract mode. So by default it's on add, so it will generally push your clay on the outside in the positive direction of the normals. So in this direction, for example, and in subtract that will be inverted. So for the mask it will allow you to clear the mask here, and if I take any draw brush here, set it to subtract, it will push the vertices inside. So let's switch to add. We can do the same thing by pressing Ctrl, and whenever we hold Shift, we get to the smooth brush. So this isn't a brush that you will go for, as it's included by simply holding Shift while brushing your mesh. I will just enable the dynamic topology here. Then I will use subdivide collapse to avoid getting too many vertices, because if you use only subdivide edge, whenever you will brush a surface, it will subdivide it. So you may get very high details where it's not necessary, and it might be quite complicated to deal with those, even if it's based on a resolution here. So generally I use the subdivide collapse so that it allows me to have an average number of vertices per area based on this detail size, and I always use the constant detail because the relative detail is based on the zoom here. So if I zoom a lot and brush the surface, you can see that the density here is pretty high compared to our base mesh, while if I unzoom, you see that it's not consistent. While using constant detail here, so it's a bit too high, I will increase the resolution to 100, for example. You can see that I get very thin details here, and if I unzoom, the resolution is the same. So the difference is that in previous version of Blender, the resolution for the constant detail was based also on this value, but it was inverted. The closer you get to 0, the finer the detail were. So it was mostly a detail size than a resolution. Now it's more obvious using a resolution. The higher you get, the thinner the details. So one thing that is very cool with dynamic topology compared, for example, to Dynamesh in ZBrush, is that Blender will add more resolution only on the area that is brushed. So if we check here our resolution, here it's still quite low poly, while here it's very high poly. While in ZBrush you will have to update your mesh and it will propagate the highest resolution over the mesh. So it has also its strength. I'm not saying that Dynamesh in ZBrush is not good, because it's very good, but that's one of the very cool thing about dynamic topology in Blender. The other thing that is really cool compared to using the multi-resolution workflow is that we create geometry on the fly. So that's very cool. Now let's have a look at some of the options here. So we have this detail fluid field that I used when I'm polishing my model. So what it will do is that it will take the current resolution and subdivide everything here. So I will click it. It will take a few seconds to process. And here we are. We have a constant detail size all over the mesh. If I uncheck here the symmetry and I work on the side, and then I decide that I wanted this to be symmetrized, you can do it here. So you have to choose which way you want to do it, from -x, so this side, to this side, or inverted by selecting those here. You can even change the axis. So I will keep the default one, click symmetrize, and Blender will symmetrize the mesh. Here we are. So this is very handy when you've forgotten to set it when sculpting, for example, the character. So this is something I will be using. So here we have our brush profile. That's pretty easy to understand, because we can see that what we are sculpting here is based on this profile. The center of the brush, the out part of the brush, so the border, let's say. So here it's very hard edged, and here it's very peaky, let's say. Not that much, but a little more than this one. Maybe using this one will be more interesting. Yeah. So we can crease stuff here if we want. Okay, so I won't go that much into the option, because it's not really necessary, and we have seen mostly what we'll be using. What I want to show you now is the brush I'm always using. So there is the grab brush that will allow us to pull stuff, and the benefit of this brush is that it doesn't create more geometry. So to work on base proportion, this is very handy. Then I use a lot the brush number 3, which is the gray strip. It's very nice to build muscles and basic shape, because you just brush your character or any part or anything following the muscle flow, and then when you smooth things, you get a nice muscle shape smoothed. So you will see me using this a lot. I use a lot the scrap brush, and will make intensive use of this at the end. So this allows you to flatten and remove chunks of geometry. Very nice. And finally, I use a lot the pinch brush. So one thing with the pinch brush that I always do is that here, if I pinch, as soon as the geometry gets tighter and tighter, Blender will collapse using those dynamic topology options. As I don't want to go into subdivide edge, as it will create a lot more geometry here, I can achieve the same result by simply getting out of Dyne Topo whenever I use the pinch brush. So I press Ctrl D, it will deactivate it, and now when I pinch, it doesn't create more geometry, it just pinch the current one without destroying it. So this is a very handy way to flatten areas and define them very easily. Now there is one thing that happens oftenly on a mesh with dynamic topology, so I will try to create the bug here. So whenever you have a very thin layer like this, and you go into dynamic topology and brush one side, let's say you want to crease this, and we get a mirrored, I don't know how to say it, but like what we're doing on the side is affecting the other side, and this is because we reach the threshold where we don't have any depth to our mesh, and this is a problem you will oftenly have whenever you use a too small resolution. It happens oftenly when we do the fingers. So you can try then using other brush to solve this, like the draw brush, etc. There is one brush that will save you here, is the inflate brush. So we have it here, we can press I to use it, and as it inflates the mesh, it will push positively along the normals our mesh on both sides. So this will fix the problem. So I can brush here my very thin geometry, smooth it a little, and now whenever I will crease with this brush, I won't get the problem again. So I might use it. Keep this tip in mind if I forget to remind about it, and if we meet the problem during this course. Okay, so let's get started with the sculpting of the base mesh.